Marcus Thompson's hand froze on his radio, the morning patrol report dying on his lips as he stared at the massive black bear blocking the forest trail ahead. The bear wasn't attacking, it was staring directly at him with an intelligence that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just any bear. This was hope. The radio crackled with panicked voices from headquarters. "All units, we have multiple bear sightings approaching the visitor center. They're acting aggressively towards staff but won't harm anyone." A distant scream echoed through the trees as tourists fled in terror. Marcus remembered the tiny, lifeless cub he'd pulled from Yellowstone Lake 3 years ago, how those same dark eyes had looked at him with trust as he breathed life back into her lungs. Now those eyes held something else entirely. Desperation mixed with fierce determination. "Hope, what are you trying to tell me?" he whispered, his hand moving slowly away from his weapon. The bear stepped closer, grabbed his jacket sleeve with surprising gentleness, and began pulling him deeper into the forest toward something he couldn't yet see. What had driven his rescued cub to terrify an entire park? And why did Marcus feel like his life depended on following her? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years earlier, Marcus Thompson had found his calling in the pristine wilderness of Yellowstone National Park. At 40, the former Marine medic carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen both the worst and best of humanity. His weathered hands, scarred from years of military service in Afghanistan, now worked gently with injured wildlife instead of wounded soldiers. The transition from saving human lives to protecting nature's creatures had been his salvation after losing his wife, Sarah, in a senseless car accident 5 years prior. The ranger station near Yellowstone Lake had become Marcus's sanctuary. Every morning at dawn, he would patrol the shoreline where tourists and wildlife intersected in an endless dance of wonder and potential danger. His colleagues respected his dedication, though some whispered that he cared too much about the animals, a criticism that never bothered him. After Sarah's death, when he couldn't save the person who mattered most, these creatures had become his family. Yellowstone Lake stretched endlessly before him, its crystal-clear waters reflecting the towering peaks that surrounded this natural cathedral. During summer months, the area bustled with families eager to glimpse the park's famous wildlife, but Marcus preferred the quiet hours when only the animals moved through their ancient routines. The lake's ecosystem supported everything from tiny trout to massive grizzly bears, each playing their role in nature's delicate balance. Among the park's recent additions was Dr. Richard Blackwood, a renowned wildlife behavioral scientist from Stanford University. At 55, Dr. Blackwood commanded respect wherever he went, his silver hair and expensive field gear marking him as someone important. The Park Service had granted him unprecedented access to conduct what he called groundbreaking research on animal cognition and trauma response. His credentials were impeccable: published papers, university tenure, and glowing recommendations from colleagues across the country. Marcus had met Dr. Blackwood several times during his first month at Yellowstone. The scientist was charming and articulate, speaking passionately about his work helping animals recover from traumatic experiences. He explained how his research could revolutionize wildlife management, making interactions between humans and animals safer for everyone involved. The park's leadership hung on his every word, excited to be associated with such prestigious work. Yet something about Dr. Blackwood unsettled Marcus in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was how the man's eyes seemed to catalog everything, as if every conversation was being filed away for later analysis. Or maybe it was his intense interest in Marcus's daily patrol routes and wildlife encounters. When Dr. Blackwood asked detailed questions about animal behavior patterns, Marcus attributed it to scientific curiosity. After all, what harm could come from legitimate research? The partnership between the Park Service and Dr. Blackwood's team represented the kind of collaboration that conservation efforts desperately needed. With proper funding and scientific backing, they could finally understand what drove wildlife behavior and prevent dangerous encounters before they happened. Marcus, like everyone else, believed they were on the cusp of something truly beneficial for both humans and animals alike. The morning of June 15th began like any other, with Marcus conducting his routine patrol around Yellowstone Lake as the first golden rays of sunlight pierced through the pine canopy. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the familiar scents of wildflowers and fresh mountain water. At 6:30 a.m., the park was still peaceful, with most tourists still asleep in their campsites and cabins. This was Marcus's favorite time, when Yellowstone belonged entirely to its wild inhabitants. As he rounded the northern bend of the lake, an unusual sound caught his attention. It wasn't the typical splashing of fish or the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. This was different, desperate, panicked. Marcus stopped his truck and stepped out, his trained ears focusing on the distress calls echoing across the water. What he heard made his blood run cold, the frantic bellowing of a mother bear in distress. Through his binoculars, Marcus spotted the source of the commotion. A young black bear cub, probably no more than 6 months old, was struggling in the frigid waters of Yellowstone Lake about 50 yards from shore. The little animal was tangled in what appeared to be discarded fishing net, the synthetic material wrapped tightly around its chest and front legs. Each desperate attempt to swim only tightened the deadly trap, pulling the exhausted cub deeper beneath the surface. On the rocky shoreline, the mother bear paced frantically, her powerful claws scraping against stone as she called to her drowning baby. She was a magnificent creature, probably weighing close to 300 pounds, her black fur gleaming in the morning sun. Her maternal instinct screamed at her to enter the water, but some deeper wisdom held her back, perhaps understanding that her massive weight would only complicate the rescue, or sensing that the water was too deep for her to maintain footing while helping her cub. Marcus felt his heart racing as he calculated the situation. Park regulations were crystal clear. Rangers were strictly forbidden from direct intervention with wildlife. The proper protocol was to immediately radio for the specialized wildlife rescue team and establish a safe perimeter until they arrived. The estimated response time was 45 minutes minimum, given their current location at the park's most remote monitoring station. But 45 minutes might as well have been 45 hours. The cub was already showing signs of severe exhaustion, its small head bobbing beneath the surface for increasingly longer periods. The water temperature in Yellowstone Lake hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit even during summer months, cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. Marcus watched in horror as the cub's struggles grew weaker, its desperate squeaks becoming fainter with each passing second. The radio crackled on his belt, but Marcus found himself unable to reach for it. Instead, he heard Sarah's voice echoing in his memory from their last conversation before her accident. They had been discussing his decision to leave the military for Park Service work, and she had smiled at him with that knowing look she always wore when she was about to say something profound. "Marcus," she had said, taking his scarred hands in hers, "you've spent so many years following orders and protocols. Promise me that when it really matters, you'll always choose to save a life, no matter what the rule book says." The cub's head disappeared beneath the surface again, staying under for what felt like an eternity. When it finally emerged, gasping and weak, Marcus knew he was out of time. "Regulations be damned," he muttered under his breath, already stripping off his ranger jacket and boots. The water hit him like a physical blow, instantly stealing his breath and sending shock waves through his nervous system. Even with his military training and years of conditioning, the cold of Yellowstone Lake was overwhelming. Every stroke toward the drowning cub required enormous willpower as his muscles began to cramp and his core temperature started to drop. Behind him, he could hear the mother bear's agitated calls growing louder, but he didn't dare look back to see if she was entering the water herself. Swimming in the mountain lake was nothing like the controlled environments where he had trained as a combat medic. The bottom dropped away into blackness just a few feet from shore, and the crystal clear water was deceptively deep. Each stroke forward felt like swimming through liquid ice, and Marcus had to fight against his body's natural instinct to turn back toward the warmth and safety of land. When he finally reached the cub, the situation was even worse than he had feared. The fishing net was not just tangled around the animal. It was cutting deep into its flesh, having tightened like a noose as the cub struggled. The little bear's eyes were glazed with exhaustion and hypothermia, and its breathing was shallow and irregular. Worse still, it had stopped struggling entirely, floating limply in Marcus's arms as he tried to assess the damage. Working with numb fingers, Marcus pulled out his utility knife and began the delicate process of cutting through the net without injuring the cub further. Each cut had to be precise, as the synthetic material had embedded itself in the animal's thick fur and was dangerously close to vital blood vessels. The cub's body felt frighteningly cold and limp, and Marcus realized with growing dread that it might already be too late. As he finally freed the last strand of netting, the cub suddenly went completely still. Its small chest stopped rising and falling, and its dark eyes stared sightlessly at the morning sky. For a moment, Marcus felt the familiar, crushing weight of failure. The same sensation that had overwhelmed him when the paramedics told him there was nothing more they could do for Sarah. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't helpless. Drawing on every piece of medical training he possessed, Marcus began the desperate swim back to shore while supporting the lifeless cub against his chest. The mother bear had moved closer to the water's edge, her massive form silhouetted against the sunrise as she watched the rescue attempt with an intelligence that seemed almost human. As Marcus's feet finally touched the rocky lake bottom, she made no aggressive moves, as if understanding that this strange human was trying to help her baby. Marcus laid the cub on its side on the gravelly shore, water streaming from its waterlogged fur. The little animal showed no signs of life, no breathing, no heartbeat, no response to touch. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Marcus knelt beside the motionless form, his own body shaking from cold and exhaustion. Then his medical training took over completely, and he began the most important resuscitation of his life. Marcus positioned his hands on the cub's tiny ribcage, feeling the delicate bones beneath the waterlogged fur. Bear physiology was different from human anatomy, but the basic principles of cardiopulmonary resuscitation remained the same. He began chest compressions, using just 2 fingers to avoid crushing the fragile bones, counting steadily under his breath as he had been trained to do with human patients. The cub's body was so small that his hands nearly covered its entire torso. After 30 compressions, Marcus tilted the cub's head back slightly and covered its small muzzle with his mouth, breathing gently into its lungs. The procedure felt surreal, giving mouth-to-snout resuscitation to a wild bear while its massive mother watched just 20 feet away. Each breath had to be carefully measured. Too much force could rupture the delicate lung tissue, while too little wouldn't provide adequate oxygenation. The mother bear remained motionless, her dark eyes fixed on Marcus's every movement. There was something almost mystical about her stillness, as if she understood that this human was fighting for her baby's life. Occasionally, she would emit a low, rumbling sound, not aggressive, but something closer to encouragement. Marcus had never experienced anything like it in his years of wildlife work. 8 agonizing minutes passed with no response from the cub. Marcus's arms ached from the repetitive compressions, and his own core temperature was dropping dangerously low from his soaked clothing and the morning chill. Doubt began creeping into his mind. Perhaps he was too late. Perhaps all his efforts were merely delaying the inevitable. In his peripheral vision, he noticed a figure with binoculars watching from the tree line, but he was too focused on the resuscitation to pay attention to the observer. Then, suddenly, the cub's small chest heaved with its first independent breath. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face as the little animal's lungs filled with air. A second breath followed, then a third, each one stronger than the last. The cub's eyes fluttered open, dark and confused, but unmistakably alive. Its tiny paws began to move weakly, and it made small mewling sounds that immediately caught its mother's attention. The mother bear approached cautiously, her massive head lowering to sniff her baby. The cub attempted to lift its head toward her familiar scent, and she began gently licking its wet fur with her enormous pink tongue. Marcus slowly backed away, giving the family space while keeping a careful eye on the mother's behavior. This was the most dangerous moment. A protective mother bear could easily view him as a threat now that her cub was conscious. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The mother bear looked directly at Marcus, holding his gaze for a long moment that seemed to communicate something profound. It wasn't aggression or fear, but what could only be described as gratitude. She seemed to understand that this human had saved her baby's life, and in that moment, an invisible bond formed between them. "Well, that was quite remarkable," came a voice from behind Marcus. He turned to see Dr. Richard Blackwood emerging from the forest, expensive camera equipment hanging around his neck and a leather notebook in his hands. The scientist appeared genuinely excited, his eyes bright with scientific curiosity. "I've been documenting wildlife behavior in this area for my research, and I must say, I've never witnessed anything quite like what just occurred here." Marcus stood slowly, still shivering from his soaked clothes and the adrenaline crash following the rescue. "Dr. Blackwood, what are you doing out here so early?" "Early morning observations often yield the most interesting data," Blackwood replied, approaching carefully while keeping a respectful distance from the bear family. "The interaction between you and that mother bear, the way she seemed to understand your intentions and trust you with her offspring, it's absolutely fascinating from a behavioral standpoint." The cub was now sitting upright, still weak but clearly recovering. Its mother continued her attentive grooming, occasionally glancing at Marcus as if acknowledging his continued presence. The little bear looked directly at Marcus several times, its dark eyes seeming to study his face with unusual intensity. "I'd like to propose something," Dr. Blackwood continued, pulling out his notebook and jotting down observations. "This cub has just experienced significant trauma, near drowning, hypothermia, oxygen deprivation. From a research perspective, it would be incredibly valuable to monitor its recovery process. We could learn so much about how young bears process and overcome traumatic experiences." Marcus frowned, his protective instincts immediately activated. "These are wild animals, Dr. Blackwood. They need to return to their natural behavior patterns as quickly as possible." Of course," Blackwood agreed quickly, his tone reassuring. "I'm not suggesting anything invasive or harmful, just observational research. Perhaps we could set up a temporary monitoring station nearby, completely non-intrusive. The data we could gather about trauma recovery in young mammals could revolutionize wildlife rehabilitation efforts." The scientist's enthusiasm was infectious, and his credentials were impeccable. Marcus found himself considering the proposal despite his initial reservations. What exactly would this monitoring involve? "Simple observation protocols," Blackwood explained, his pen moving rapidly across the notebook pages. "Behavioral documentation, perhaps some basic health assessments to ensure the cub shows no lasting effects from today's incident. The research could benefit countless other animals in similar situations." As they spoke, the cub attempted to stand on shaky legs. Its mother immediately moved to support it, using her massive body as a brace. The little bear took a few tentative steps, then looked back at Marcus with what seemed like recognition. It was a moment that would be etched in Marcus's memory forever. The instant when a wild animal appeared to acknowledge the human who had saved its life. "The bonding behavior we're witnessing is extraordinary," Blackwood murmured, scribbling furiously. "The cub appears to have imprinted on you as a secondary caregiver figure. This could provide unprecedented insights into cross-species attachment formation." Marcus watched as the mother bear began leading her cubs slowly toward the forest, but the little animal kept turning back to look at him. Each backward glance seemed deliberate, as if the cub was memorizing his face and scent. The mother bear also paused several times, her own gaze returning to Marcus with that same expression of profound gratitude. "If we proceed with the monitoring," Marcus said carefully, "I want guarantees that nothing will interfere with their natural behavior. No capturing, no handling, nothing that would cause additional stress." "Absolutely," Blackwood assured him. "The research would be purely observational. In fact, your involvement would be crucial. The cub has clearly formed an attachment to you, which could provide valuable data about interspecies trust development." As the bear family disappeared into the trees, Marcus felt an unexpected emptiness. The rescue had awakened something protective within him, a paternal instinct that surprised him with its intensity. The idea of never seeing the cub again was strangely painful. "We should call her Hope," Marcus said suddenly, the name emerging from somewhere deep in his heart. Blackwood looked up from his notes, eyebrows raised. "Park protocol discourages naming wild animals." "Hope," Marcus repeated firmly. "After what she's survived today, she deserves a name that reflects her strength." The scientist nodded slowly, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Hope it is, then. And I suspect this is just the beginning of a very special relationship." As they walked back toward Marcus's patrol truck, Blackwood continued taking notes and asking detailed questions about the rescue. His scientific enthusiasm seemed genuine, and his proposed research appeared to offer legitimate benefits for wildlife conservation. Marcus found himself agreeing to the monitoring program, believing he was contributing to important scientific advancement while maintaining a connection to the remarkable little bear who had already captured his heart. Neither man noticed the small electronic device that Dr. Blackwood discreetly attached to a tree trunk near where the rescue had taken place, or the way his eyes lingered on the trail the bears had taken into the forest. The morning sun climbed higher over Yellowstone Lake, casting long shadows through the pine trees and marking the beginning of a relationship that would prove far more complex than Marcus could possibly imagine. Over the following weeks, Dr. Blackwood's research team established what appeared to be a legitimate monitoring station near the rescue site. The temporary facility consisted of several camouflaged observation blinds and an array of motion-activated cameras positioned throughout the area where Hope and her mother had been spotted. Marcus was impressed by the professional setup and the team's apparent commitment to non-invasive research methods. Hope's recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. Within just a few days of the rescue, she was actively exploring her environment and displaying normal cub behaviors. However, what surprised Marcus most was her unusual attachment to him. During his daily patrols, Hope would often appear near the trail, sometimes accompanied by her mother, sometimes alone. She would watch him from a safe distance, her dark eyes tracking his movements with remarkable focus. Dr. Blackwood documented every encounter with meticulous detail. "The bonding behavior is extraordinary," he explained to Marcus during one of their regular briefings. "Hope demonstrates recognition patterns typically seen only in domesticated animals. She's able to distinguish your footsteps from other humans, responds to your voice from considerable distances, and shows clear signs of anticipation when you approach her territory." The research team had constructed a temporary enclosure for closer observation, which they assured Marcus was purely for Hope's protection during her most vulnerable recovery period. The enclosure was spacious and naturalistic, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the forest. Hope's mother was initially hesitant about the arrangement, but she seemed to understand that her cub was receiving beneficial care. Marcus found himself visiting the enclosure daily, often spending his lunch breaks sitting quietly nearby while Hope played or rested. The cub's intelligence became increasingly apparent through these interactions. She learned to recognize the sound of his truck engine and would position herself near the fence whenever he arrived. Most remarkably, she began responding to basic verbal cues, something Dr. Blackwood insisted was unprecedented in wild bear behavior. "Hope, come here," Marcus would call softly, and the cub would approach the fence, standing on her hind legs to get closer to him. When he said sit, she would lower herself into a sitting position, watching him expectantly. These behaviors delighted the research team and provided what they claimed was groundbreaking data about animal cognition and learning capacity. Dr. Blackwood's excitement about the research results was palpable. "We're witnessing something revolutionary," he told Marcus during one of their evening discussions. "Hope's cognitive development following her trauma appears to have accelerated beyond normal parameters. The stress response may have triggered enhanced neuroplasticity, allowing her to form more complex associations and memories than typically observed in her species." However, as the weeks progressed, Marcus began noticing subtle changes that concerned him. Hope occasionally displayed listlessness that seemed uncharacteristic for a young bear. There were mornings when she appeared groggy and disoriented, as if she had difficulty waking up. When Marcus mentioned these observations to Dr. Blackwood, the scientist explained them as normal fluctuations in recovery patterns. "Young animals often experience irregular sleep cycles following traumatic events," Blackwood assured him. "We're monitoring her closely, and I can assure you that her overall health metrics remain excellent. These temporary phases are actually quite common in trauma recovery research." Hope's mother became increasingly agitated during visits to the enclosure. The massive bear would pace along the perimeter, vocalizing in ways that Marcus had never heard before. Her calls seemed urgent, almost pleading, and Hope would respond with her own distressed sounds. Dr. Blackwood dismissed these behaviors as natural separation anxiety, explaining that gradual reintroduction to the wild required a careful adjustment period. One morning, Marcus discovered small, precise scars along Hope's neck and behind her ears, thin lines that looked almost surgical in their uniformity. When he questioned Dr. Blackwood about them, the scientist's explanation was swift and seemingly reasonable. "We've had to administer some medical treatments," Blackwood explained, showing Marcus official-looking veterinary documents. "Hope developed a minor infection from her near-drowning experience, and we needed to provide antibiotic treatments. The scarring is minimal and will fade completely as she grows." Despite these reassurances, Marcus's instincts as a former combat medic told him something wasn't right. The scars were too precise, too deliberately placed. They looked nothing like the rough healing patterns he would expect from infection treatment. When he attempted to examine Hope more closely, the research team politely but firmly discouraged physical contact, citing safety protocols and research integrity concerns. Marcus began paying closer attention to the research facility's operations. During off-duty hours, he conducted informal surveillance of the area, noting patterns in the team's activities. He observed that certain procedures occurred during late evening hours when the park was closed to visitors. Equipment was occasionally brought in under cover of darkness, and team members seemed unusually secretive about their specific research protocols. Most disturbing were the sounds that occasionally emanated from the facility during nighttime hours. Marcus heard animal vocalizations that seemed distressed, not just from Hope, but from other creatures that he couldn't identify. When he questioned Dr. Blackwood about additional research subjects, the scientist's response was evasive. "We're conducting parallel studies on trauma recovery across multiple species," Blackwood explained vaguely. "The comparative data helps us understand universal principles of resilience and adaptation. All our research subjects are being cared for according to the highest ethical standards." Hope's behavior became increasingly erratic. During Marcus's visits, she would sometimes approach the fence eagerly, then suddenly retreat as if frightened by something unseen. She developed a peculiar habit of covering her ears with her paws and rocking back and forth, a behavior that Dr. Blackwood described as adaptive self-soothing, but which reminded Marcus uncomfortably of trauma responses he had witnessed in human patients. The most alarming development was Hope's reaction to Dr. Blackwood himself. Initially, she had shown neutral curiosity toward all research team members. However, as time progressed, she began displaying clear signs of fear whenever Blackwood approached. She would retreat to the far corner of her enclosure, make distressed vocalizations, and remain agitated long after he had left. Marcus confronted Blackwood about Hope's obvious distress. "She's terrified of you specifically. That's not normal behavior for an animal that should trust her caregivers." Blackwood's response revealed the first crack in his professional composure. Research animals sometimes develop irrational aversions to particular individuals. It's a known phenomenon in behavioral studies. What matters is the overall quality of care and the scientific value of the data we're collecting. The term research animals struck Marcus as particularly cold, especially when referring to Hope. He began questioning other aspects of the research program, requesting to see detailed protocols and ethical review documentation. Dr. Blackwood became increasingly defensive about such requests, citing proprietary research methods and confidentiality agreements with funding institutions. During one late evening patrol, Marcus discovered Hope attempting to dig beneath the fence of her enclosure. Her paws were bloody from scratching at the hard-packed earth, and she was vocalizing in a pattern that sounded remarkably like distress calls. When she saw Marcus, she approached the fence and began what could only be described as pleading behavior, reaching through the wire mesh, touching his hands, and making soft sounds that seemed designed to communicate urgent need. "What are you trying to tell me, girl?" Marcus whispered, allowing Hope to touch his fingers through the fence. She gently grasped his hand with her small paw and pulled it toward a particular section of the enclosure. Following her guidance, Marcus discovered small electronic devices hidden in the vegetation, sophisticated equipment that looked nothing like the simple observation cameras Dr. Blackwood had described. The devices were clearly designed for more than passive monitoring. They included speakers that could emit sounds beyond human hearing range and sensors that appeared capable of measuring physiological responses in real time. Marcus photographed the equipment with his phone, his suspicions now crystallizing into genuine alarm. Hope's mother had become increasingly aggressive toward the research team, requiring physical barriers to prevent her from interfering with facility operations. The massive bear spent hours pacing the perimeter, her calls becoming more desperate each day. Marcus observed that she seemed to be trying to lead other bears to the area, as if seeking help from her own kind. The breaking point came when Marcus arrived for his usual morning visit to find Hope in a state of complete lethargy. She barely acknowledged his presence, lying motionless in a corner of the enclosure with her eyes only partially open. When he called her name, she lifted her head with obvious effort, but couldn't maintain the position for more than a few seconds. Dr. Blackwood assured Marcus that Hope was simply experiencing normal adolescent growth patterns that required increased rest. However, Marcus's medical training told him otherwise. The cub's symptoms looked suspiciously like the effects of chemical sedation or neurological manipulation. Her pupils were dilated, her reflexes were sluggish, and her coordination was significantly impaired. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He would conduct his own investigation into Dr. Blackwood's research program, starting with the hidden facility he had glimpsed in the forest beyond the official monitoring station. Hope's life might depend on uncovering the truth about what was really happening in the name of scientific research. As he prepared for his covert investigation, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Hope was trying to warn him about something far more sinister than unethical research practices. Her increasingly desperate attempts to communicate suggested that she understood her situation better than any wild animal should be able to. The question that haunted him was whether he would discover the truth in time to save her, and whether the truth itself might be more horrifying than he could possibly imagine. Marcus waited until well past midnight before beginning his investigation of Dr. Blackwood's hidden facility. The moon was new, providing natural cover as he made his way through the dense forest beyond the official monitoring station. He had studied the area during daylight hours, noting unusual tire tracks and footpaths that led deeper into the wilderness than any legitimate research would require. Armed with only a small flashlight and his camera, Marcus moved silently through the trees, drawing on military training he hadn't used in years. The hidden facility was larger and more sophisticated than anything Marcus had imagined. Concealed behind a natural rock formation and camouflaged with military precision netting, the structure looked more like a covert operations base than a wildlife research station. Multiple buildings were connected by covered walkways, and the entire complex was surrounded by high-voltage fencing that hummed ominously in the darkness. This was no temporary monitoring station. This was a permanent installation that had clearly been under construction for months, if not years. Through a gap in the camouflage netting, Marcus could see into what appeared to be a sophisticated laboratory. Stainless steel examination tables gleamed under harsh fluorescent lighting, surrounded by medical equipment that looked far too advanced for simple wildlife research. Computer monitors displayed data streams and vital signs from multiple subjects, their screens casting an eerie blue glow throughout the facility. Most disturbing were the rows of cages lining the walls, enclosures that contained not just Hope, but dozens of other animals. Marcus counted at least 20 different creatures in various states of consciousness. There were young wolves, several bear cubs of different ages, mountain lions, and even a few elk calves. All appeared to be fitted with sophisticated monitoring equipment, not the simple tracking collars used in legitimate wildlife research, but complex devices that seemed to interface directly with the animals' nervous systems. Many of the creatures displayed the same lethargic, disoriented behavior that Marcus had observed in Hope. Moving closer to the main laboratory building, Marcus discovered detailed documentation scattered across multiple workstations. Research logs revealed the true scope of Dr. Blackwood's program, and what he read made his blood run cold. This wasn't research into trauma recovery. It was systematic experimentation in behavioral modification and psychological conditioning. The animals were being subjected to various forms of stress testing, sensory manipulation, and what could only be described as torture designed to break their natural instincts and rebuild them according to human specifications. Hope's file was among the most extensive. Marcus photographed page after page of documentation detailing surgical procedures, chemical injections, and psychological conditioning protocols that had been performed on the cub over the past several weeks. The research notes described her as an ideal subject due to her existing trauma history and unusual attachment to human caregivers. Dr. Blackwood's team had been using her trust in Marcus as a tool for manipulation, exploiting her emotional vulnerability to conduct increasingly invasive procedures. The most horrifying revelation came in Dr. Blackwood's personal research notes, written in his distinctive handwriting. Marcus discovered the scientist's true motivation for the program, and it had nothing to do with advancing wildlife conservation. 10 years earlier, Dr. Blackwood's 8-year-old son Tommy had been killed in a bear attack while camping with his family in Montana. The tragedy had destroyed Blackwood's marriage and consumed his life with an obsession for revenge against the animals he held responsible for his son's death. What had begun as legitimate research into preventing human-wildlife conflicts had gradually twisted into something far more sinister. Dr. Blackwood's notes revealed his belief that wild animals could be reprogrammed to be completely subservient to human control, eliminating any possibility of future attacks. His ultimate goal was to develop techniques that could be applied to entire wildlife populations, effectively domesticating all dangerous species through technological intervention. The research was being funded by a coalition of wealthy individuals who had suffered similar losses to wildlife attacks, along with several government agencies interested in the military applications of animal behavior control. Marcus found correspondence detailing plans to expand the program to multiple national parks, with the eventual goal of creating a network of facilities across the country. Hope and the other animals were test subjects in what amounted to a war against the natural world. As Marcus photographed the incriminating evidence, he heard footsteps approaching the laboratory building. Quickly concealing himself behind a bank of computer equipment, he watched as Dr. Blackwood entered with 2 research assistants. The scientist looked haggard and obsessed, his usually pristine appearance disheveled and his eyes displaying the intensity of someone who had lost touch with reality. "The Thompson subject is showing remarkable progress," Blackwood told his assistants, referring to Hope by Marcus's last name. "Her emotional attachment to the ranger makes her exceptionally malleable. We'll begin Phase 3 conditioning tomorrow night." Marcus listened in horror as Dr. Blackwood outlined procedures that would permanently alter Hope's neurological structure, essentially lobotomizing her capacity for independent thought while preserving her physical abilities. The goal was to create an animal that appeared normal, but was completely incapable of aggressive behavior toward humans, even in defense of her own life. "What about the ranger?" one assistant asked. "He's becoming suspicious about the extended research timeline." Dr. Blackwood's expression turned cold and calculating. Marcus Thompson has served his purpose. His emotional bond with the subject has provided valuable data about human-animal attachment. Once we complete Phase 3, we'll arrange for his transfer to another park. If he proves problematic, there are more permanent solutions. The casual way Dr. Blackwood discussed eliminating Marcus sent chills down his spine. This wasn't just animal abuse. It was a conspiracy involving multiple felonies and potentially murder. Marcus realized that his own life was now in danger, along with Hope's and all the other innocent creatures trapped in this nightmare facility. Continuing his documentation, Marcus discovered evidence of animals that had died during the experimental procedures. Detailed autopsy reports revealed that dozens of creatures had succumbed to the stress of conditioning, surgical complications, or simple despair. Their bodies had been disposed of in a remote area of the park, far from any tourist trails where they might be discovered. Most heartbreaking were the video recordings of the conditioning sessions. Marcus watched footage of Hope being subjected to intense psychological manipulation designed to break her spirit and rebuild her personality according to Dr. Blackwood's specifications. The techniques included sensory deprivation, exposure to recorded sounds of her mother in distress, and various forms of physical discomfort that stopped just short of leaving permanent damage. The recording showed Hope's gradual transformation from a spirited, intelligent cub into the lethargic, confused creature Marcus had observed in recent days. Her natural bear behaviors were being systematically erased and replaced with responses that served human purposes. The process was destroying everything that made her unique while preserving the shell of her physical existence. Marcus also found plans for Hope's eventual fate. Once her conditioning was complete, she would be released back into the wild as a proof-of-concept demonstration. Dr. Blackwood intended to use her as evidence that dangerous wildlife could be rendered harmless while appearing to remain in their natural state. Government officials and potential investors would observe Hope's docile behavior around humans as justification for expanding the program nationwide. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Blackwood's research succeeded, it could lead to the systematic psychological destruction of entire species. Wild animals would become living robots, maintaining the appearance of natural behavior while being stripped of everything that made them truly wild. The natural world would be transformed into a carefully controlled theme park where genuine wildness had been eliminated through technological dominance. As Marcus prepared to leave the facility with his evidence, he made a devastating discovery. Security monitors showed that his infiltration had not gone unnoticed. Motion sensors had detected his presence, and Dr. Blackwood's team was already mobilizing to capture him. Armed guards were positioned at all exit points, and tracking dogs were being released to hunt him through the forest. Worse still, Marcus realized that his investigation had put Hope in immediate danger. Dr. Blackwood's paranoia would lead him to accelerate the conditioning process, potentially killing Hope in his rush to complete the experiments before authorities could intervene. The cub's life now hung in the balance, dependent on Marcus's ability to escape with the evidence and expose the conspiracy before it was too late. As searchlights began sweeping through the forest and the sound of approaching footsteps grew closer, Marcus made a desperate decision. He would have to abandon his careful escape plan and make a direct run for freedom, knowing that failure would mean not only his own death, but the continuation of Dr. Blackwood's horrific experiments on countless innocent animals. The evidence in his camera represented the only hope for Hope and all the other victims of this twisted research program. The chase through Yellowstone's wilderness was about to begin, and Marcus knew that everything, his life, Hope's future, and the fate of America's wildlife, depended on his ability to outrun trained killers through terrain that offered both sanctuary and deadly peril. Marcus burst from the hidden facility into the darkness of Yellowstone's wilderness, his heart pounding as searchlights swept through the trees behind him. The evidence on his camera could expose Dr. Blackwood's horrific experiments, but only if he could survive long enough to reach the authorities. Shouts echoed through the forest as armed guards coordinated their pursuit, their voices carrying the cold professionalism of men accustomed to eliminating problems permanently. The terrain worked both for and against him. Marcus knew these trails better than Blackwood's hired security team, but the darkness made navigation treacherous. Root systems and fallen logs created invisible obstacles that could send him tumbling into ravines or alert his pursuers to his location. He moved as quickly as possible while trying to minimize noise, drawing on military training that felt both familiar and rusty after years of peaceful park service. Behind him, the tracking dogs had picked up his scent. Their baying grew steadily closer, a sound that made Marcus's blood run cold. These weren't search and rescue animals. They were attack dogs trained to bring down fleeing targets. He could hear their handlers encouraging them with commands that left no doubt about their lethal intentions. As Marcus crested a ridge overlooking the valley where Hope's original rescue had taken place, he made a horrifying discovery. Dr. Blackwood's team wasn't just pursuing him, they were systematically destroying evidence at the facility. Explosions lit up the night sky as buildings were demolished, and Marcus realized that his infiltration had triggered a complete evacuation protocol. The animals imprisoned in those cages were being eliminated, along with the physical evidence of their torture. The thought of Hope and the other innocent creatures being murdered to cover up Dr. Blackwood's crimes filled Marcus with desperate rage. He had to reach help immediately, but his radio was useless in this remote area, and his truck was parked miles away near the official monitoring station. The nearest ranger outpost was at least 8 miles through wilderness that was becoming increasingly dangerous as his pursuers closed in. Marcus descended into the valley, hoping to use the dense forest canopy for cover, but the tracking dogs were gaining ground rapidly. Their baying had changed to the excited yelps that indicated they were close to their quarry. He could hear the crashing of underbrush as multiple teams converged on his position from different directions, cutting off potential escape routes with military precision. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, Marcus heard a sound that initially terrified him but quickly became his salvation. A massive roar echoed through the valley, not from the tracking dogs but from Hope's mother. The enormous black bear had somehow escaped from whatever restraints Dr. Blackwood's team had used to control her, and she was approaching the pursuit area with obvious aggressive intent. The tracking dogs' confident pursuit suddenly became chaos as they encountered a furious mother bear whose cub was in mortal danger. Their training hadn't prepared them for this scenario, and their handlers' shouts turned from commands to screams of terror as 300 pounds of enraged bear scattered the pursuit team. Marcus heard gunshots and human cries of pain as the confrontation erupted behind him. Hope's mother wasn't acting randomly. She seemed to understand that Marcus was connected to her cub's situation. Rather than attacking him, she positioned herself between Marcus and his pursuers, buying him precious time to escape. Her protective behavior was extraordinary, suggesting an intelligence and emotional capacity that Dr. Blackwood's research had criminally underestimated. Using the chaos to his advantage, Marcus pushed deeper into the wilderness toward the main park road where he might find help. His lungs burned from the altitude and exertion, and his legs shook with exhaustion. But the knowledge that Hope was dying while he ran drove him forward. Every second counted, and he couldn't afford to rest even as his body screamed for relief. The explosions at the facility had intensified, and Marcus could see the glow of fires burning in the distance. Dr. Blackwood was destroying decades of research rather than allow it to be exposed, which meant he was also destroying the lives of countless animals who had suffered for his twisted vision of wildlife control. The scope of the tragedy was overwhelming, but Marcus forced himself to focus on what he could still save. As dawn began to break over the mountains, Marcus finally reached the main park road. His clothes were torn from branches and thorns, his hands were bleeding from multiple cuts, and his face was streaked with dirt and sweat. But he was alive, and the camera containing evidence of Dr. Blackwood's crimes was still intact. The first vehicle he encountered was a Park Service truck driven by his supervisor, Captain Janet Sullivan. Her expression of shock at his appearance quickly turned to alarm as Marcus gasped out his story. Within minutes, Sullivan was coordinating with federal authorities while Marcus uploaded the photographic evidence to secure servers that Dr. Blackwood couldn't reach. But even as help mobilized, Marcus knew they might be too late for Hope. The facility was burning, the animals were being eliminated, and Dr. Blackwood had demonstrated that he would kill anyone who threatened his work. The race to save Hope had become a race against a madman who had nothing left to lose. The federal response team arrived at the burning facility just as the last explosions rocked the hidden complex. FBI agents, Park Service investigators, and emergency veterinarians converged on the scene, but what they found was a charnel house of systematic animal murder. Dr. Blackwood's team had executed their evacuation protocol with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind only smoking ruins and the bodies of creatures who had died as witnesses to unspeakable cruelty. Marcus stood at the perimeter of the destruction, his hands clenched into fists as he watched investigators document the carnage. Cages that had held living, breathing animals just hours before now contained only ash and bone. The sophisticated laboratory equipment had been reduced to melted metal and shattered glass. Most devastating of all, there was no sign of hope or any other survivors among the ruins. Captain Sullivan placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder as they surveyed the scene. "We've got teams searching the entire area," she assured him. "If any animals escape the facility, we'll find them." But Marcus knew the truth was grimmer than anyone wanted to admit. Dr. Blackwood had spent years planning this research program, and his evacuation protocol had been designed to eliminate all evidence of his crimes. The man who had once been a respected scientist had become a monster willing to murder innocent creatures to protect his twisted legacy. FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres approached Marcus with a grim expression. "We've identified Dr. Blackwood's vehicle heading south toward the Montana border. He's traveling with at least 3 associates and appears to be carrying equipment consistent with mobile animal containment. We believe he may have taken some of the research subjects with him." The news sent a surge of desperate hope through Marcus's chest. If Dr. Blackwood had taken Hope and other animals with him, it meant they might still be alive. But it also meant they were in the hands of a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his work. "I want to be part of the pursuit team," Marcus declared, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. Agent Torres shook her head firmly. "You're a civilian now, Thompson. This is a federal manhunt involving armed and dangerous suspects. We can't risk—" "You don't understand," Marcus interrupted, his emotions overwhelming his usual respect for authority. "Hope knows me. If she's still alive, I might be the only person who can calm her enough for a safe rescue. These animals have been tortured and traumatized. They'll be terrified of strangers." The agent studied Marcus's face, recognizing the desperate determination in his eyes. After a moment, she nodded reluctantly. "You can ride along as a civilian consultant. But you follow orders and stay back when we make contact with the suspects." The pursuit team raced south through Montana's wilderness, following intelligence reports of Dr. Blackwood's movements. Helicopter surveillance had tracked his convoy to an abandoned mining complex in the remote Bitterroot Mountains, where thermal imaging detected multiple heat signatures consistent with both humans and animals. The location was perfect for Blackwood's purposes, isolated, defensible, and equipped with underground facilities that could serve as a temporary laboratory. As they approached the mining complex, Marcus felt his heart racing with a mixture of hope and dread. Radio chatter from the surveillance aircraft confirmed the presence of animal containment equipment and what appeared to be a mobile veterinary setup. Dr. Blackwood wasn't just fleeing. He was continuing his experiments even while being hunted by federal authorities. The assault team positioned themselves around the perimeter of the complex as negotiators attempted to establish communication with Dr. Blackwood. When he finally responded, his voice carried the unhinged desperation of a man who had lost all connection to reality. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Blackwood's voice crackled over the radio. "My research could save thousands of human lives by eliminating the threat posed by dangerous wildlife. These animals are willing sacrifices for the greater good of humanity." Agent Torres tried to reason with him. "Dr. Blackwood, we know about your son Tommy. We understand your pain, but this isn't the way to honor his memory. Release the animals and surrender peacefully." Blackwood's response was a bitter laugh that sent chills through everyone listening. "Honor his memory. These beasts killed my child, and now they'll serve humanity as they should have from the beginning." Controlled, docile, stripped of their capacity for violence, it's justice. Marcus grabbed the radio from Agent Torres, ignoring her protests. "Richard, this is Marcus Thompson. I know you can hear me. Hope is just a baby. She never hurt anyone. She's innocent of whatever happened to Tommy." There was a long silence before Blackwood's voice returned, colder than before. "Innocence is an illusion, Thompson. Every wild animal carries the potential for violence. I'm simply removing that potential permanently. Your precious hope will serve as the perfect demonstration of my success." The words confirmed Marcus's worst fears. Dr. Blackwood wasn't planning to flee. He was preparing to complete his experiments on Hope and the other animals, using them as final proof of his twisted research before destroying them and himself. The mining complex wasn't a hideout. It was a tomb where Blackwood intended to complete his work and eliminate all witnesses. Thermal imaging suddenly detected increased activity within the complex, and surveillance operators reported seeing smoke rising from one of the buildings. Dr. Blackwood was beginning his final phase, and time was running out for Hope and any other surviving animals. Agent Torres made the decision to assault the complex immediately. "We can't wait for his demands or negotiate further. He's actively harming the animals as we speak." The tactical team moved swiftly through the abandoned mining facilities, their equipment designed for precision strikes that would minimize harm to any surviving creatures. Marcus followed at a safe distance, his heart pounding as they approached the main laboratory building where thermal imaging suggested the animals were being held. The first gunshots echoed through the mountain air as Dr. Blackwood's associates attempted to defend their position. These weren't scientists anymore, they were criminals who had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. The sound of automatic weapons fire mixed with the terrified cries of animals, creating a cacophony that would haunt Marcus's dreams for years to come. When the tactical team finally breached the laboratory, they found a scene that exceeded even Marcus's worst nightmares. Dr. Blackwood had accelerated his final experiments, subjecting the remaining animals to procedures that were killing them even as he desperately tried to complete his data collection. Hope was strapped to an examination table, electrodes attached to her head while machines monitored her vital signs as they weakened. Marcus rushed to Hope's side despite Agent Torres's shouted warnings. The young bear was barely conscious, her body racked with convulsions from whatever Dr. Blackwood had injected into her system. Her eyes, once bright with intelligence and trust, were glazed with pain and confusion. "Hope, I'm here," Marcus whispered, gently stroking her fur as he began disconnecting the monitoring equipment. "I'm going to get you out of here." Dr. Blackwood stood in the corner of the laboratory, his hands covered in blood and his eyes reflecting the madness that had consumed him. "You're too late," he said with disturbing calm. "The neural pathways have been permanently altered. She'll never be wild again. She'll be exactly what I created her to be." Agent Torres had her weapon trained on Blackwood, but the scientist seemed oblivious to the danger. He was fixated on his monitors, watching Hope's vital signs with the fascination of someone observing a successful experiment rather than a dying animal. Marcus felt Hope's heartbeat growing weaker beneath his hands. The procedures had damaged her beyond repair, and her young body was failing despite his desperate attempts to comfort her. In her final moments, she looked at him with eyes that seemed to recognize his voice and touch, as if some part of her original spirit had survived Dr. Blackwood's torture. As Hope took her last breath in Marcus's arms, something inside him died as well. The innocent creature who had trusted him completely had been destroyed by human cruelty, and no amount of justice could bring her back or undo the suffering she had endured. 1 month after Hope's death, Marcus sat in a sterile conference room in Washington, D.C., facing a panel of senators who would determine the future of wildlife research in America's national parks. The congressional hearing on illegal animal experimentation had drawn international attention, transforming Hope's tragic story into a catalyst for legislative change that could protect countless other creatures from similar fates. Senator Patricia Reynolds, the committee chairwoman, leaned forward as Marcus concluded his testimony. "Mr. Thompson, you've provided compelling evidence of systematic animal abuse disguised as legitimate research. In your professional opinion, how widespread do you believe these practices might be?" Marcus looked directly at the cameras broadcasting the hearing live across the nation. "Senator, based on the documentation we recovered from Dr. Blackwood's facility, this program involved multiple universities, private corporations, and at least 12 national parks. Hope was just one victim among hundreds, possibly thousands of animals who suffered and died in the name of research that had no legitimate scientific purpose." The revelation sent murmurs through the packed hearing room. Dr. Blackwood's confession during FBI interrogation had exposed a network of illegal experimentation that reached far beyond his personal vendetta against wildlife. Corporate interests seeking to develop animal control technologies had funded research that violated every principle of ethical science, turning protected wilderness areas into laboratories for systematic torture. Marcus continued his testimony, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. "Hope taught me that the bond between humans and animals transcends species barriers. She saved my life by leading me to discover Dr. Blackwood's crimes, even though she was dying from the procedures he had inflicted on her. Her intelligence, loyalty, and capacity for love proved that these creatures deserve our protection, not our exploitation." The committee had already heard devastating testimony from Dr. Blackwood himself, who had suffered a complete psychological breakdown following his arrest. The once respected scientist had confessed to years of illegal research driven by his obsession with controlling wildlife behavior. His detailed admissions revealed the scope of suffering he had caused, along with the names of collaborators who were now facing federal charges. Senator James Mitchell, known for his environmental advocacy, addressed Marcus directly. "The Hope Foundation that you've established, tell us about its mission and how it will prevent similar tragedies." Marcus felt a surge of purpose as he described the organization he had built from Hope's memory. "The Hope Foundation will monitor wildlife research across all federal lands, ensuring that every project meets the highest ethical standards. We'll also provide educational programs about the emotional and intellectual capacity of wild animals, helping people understand that these creatures are individuals deserving of respect, not test subjects for human convenience." The foundation had already received millions in donations from supporters worldwide who had been moved by Hope's story. Major wildlife conservation organizations had pledged their support, and several universities had voluntarily submitted their research programs for ethical review. Hope's death was inspiring a fundamental shift in how humans viewed their relationship with the natural world. Agent Torres, testifying alongside Marcus, provided details about the ongoing criminal investigation. "We've arrested 17 individuals involved in Dr. Blackwood's network, including researchers, corporate executives, and government officials who approved illegal experiments. The investigation has revealed systematic corruption of the research approval process, allowing unethical projects to proceed without proper oversight." The agent's testimony revealed that Dr. Blackwood's research had been funded by a consortium of wealthy individuals who had lost family members to wildlife encounters. Their grief had been manipulated by corporations seeking to develop commercially viable animal control technologies. What began as a desire to prevent human deaths had been corrupted into a profit-driven enterprise that treated living creatures as disposable resources. Marcus watched Dr. Blackwood enter the hearing room in shackles, his appearance shocking even to those who had followed his case closely. The man who had once commanded respect as a leading scientist now looked broken and hollow, his eyes carrying the haunted expression of someone who had lost all connection to humanity. His confession to the committee was detailed and remorseless, revealing the depth of his psychological deterioration. "I believed I was protecting future children from suffering my son's fate," Blackwood testified, his voice barely audible. Every animal I experimented on represented a potential threat that needed to be neutralized. I convinced myself that their suffering was justified by the human lives that would be saved. Senator Reynolds pressed him for details about Hope specifically. The bear cub that Mr. Thompson rescued, why was she particularly significant to your research? Blackwood's answer revealed the calculated cruelty behind his actions. Hope represented the perfect test subject because of her existing trauma history and attachment to Thompson. Her emotional vulnerability allowed us to measure the effectiveness of psychological conditioning techniques. She was expendable, but valuable. The cold, clinical language Blackwood used to describe Hope's torture sparked audible gasps from the gallery. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists as he listened to the man casually discuss the systematic destruction of an innocent creature who had trusted humans despite every reason not to. The committee also heard testimony from veterinarians who had examined the other animals rescued from Blackwood's network. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, described the long-term care required for survivors of the experiments. These animals have been psychologically and physically damaged in ways we're still trying to understand. Some may never be able to return to the wild because their natural behaviors have been so severely disrupted. Marcus had visited several of these survivors at rehabilitation facilities across the country. Each animal represented a small victory against Blackwood's network, but also a reminder of the countless others who hadn't been saved in time. Their recovery would take years, and some would require lifetime care in specialized sanctuaries. The legislative response to the hearings was swift and comprehensive. The HOPE Act passed both houses of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishing strict oversight protocols for all wildlife research and creating severe penalties for violations. The law also established a victim compensation fund for rehabilitation facilities caring for animals rescued from illegal experiments. As the hearings concluded, Marcus reflected on the transformation his life had undergone since that morning when he pulled a drowning bear cub from Yellowstone Lake. Hope had changed him from a park ranger following protocols into an advocate fighting for the rights of creatures who couldn't speak for themselves. Her death had been heartbreaking, but her legacy was inspiring changes that would protect thousands of other animals. Senator Reynolds delivered the committee's final statement. Hope's story reminds us that our relationship with wildlife should be based on respect and stewardship, not domination and exploitation. The courage shown by Mr. Thompson in exposing these crimes demonstrates that individual actions can create transformational change when motivated by love and justice. Marcus left Washington with a renewed sense of purpose. Hope's foundation would ensure that her suffering had meaning, that her trust in humans despite their cruelty would inspire better treatment of all wild creatures. The little bear who had been rescued from drowning had ultimately rescued the entire system of wildlife research from corruption and abuse. The congressional hearings marked the end of one chapter in Hope's story, but the beginning of a movement that would honor her memory by protecting the wild places and wild creatures that made life meaningful. Marcus knew that Hope would never be forgotten, and that her legacy would continue growing long after everyone who knew her personally had passed away. 2 years after Hope's death, Marcus stood at the memorial stone by Yellowstone Lake, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The inscription read simply, "Hope, a bear who taught us that love transcends all boundaries." Fresh wildflowers lay at the base, left by visitors who had traveled from around the world to honor the memory of a creature whose story had changed how humanity viewed its relationship with the natural world. The Hope Foundation had grown beyond Marcus's wildest dreams. What began as a small organization dedicated to ethical wildlife research oversight had become an international movement spanning 6 countries and protecting wildlife in dozens of national parks. Universities worldwide now required Hope Foundation certification before conducting any research involving wild animals, ensuring that no creature would ever again suffer the torture that had claimed Hope's life. Marcus adjusted his new title badge, Chief Wildlife Protection Officer for the entire National Park Service. His promotion had come with the responsibility of implementing the HOPE Act across all federal lands, a mission that took him to remote corners of America where wildlife and humans intersected in ways both beautiful and dangerous. Every day brought new challenges, but also the satisfaction of knowing that Hope's legacy was protecting countless other creatures. The morning patrol that had once been routine had become a pilgrimage. Marcus visited Hope's memorial every day, carrying fresh flowers and spending quiet moments reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. Sometimes tourists recognized him from the congressional hearings or the documentary that had won 3 Emmy Awards for its portrayal of Hope's story. They would approach respectfully, sharing their own stories of animals that had touched their lives and expressing gratitude for the changes his courage had inspired. Dr. Blackwood remained in federal prison, serving a life sentence for animal cruelty, conspiracy, and the murder of his research assistant, who had tried to expose the illegal experiments. His psychological evaluation revealed complete detachment from reality, with psychiatrists concluding that his grief over his son's death had evolved into a pathological hatred of all wildlife. The man who had once contributed meaningfully to conservation, science had become a cautionary tale about how trauma could corrupt even the most brilliant minds. The broader investigation had led to convictions of 47 individuals involved in the illegal research network. Corporate executives, university administrators, and government officials who had enabled or profited from animal torture were now facing justice. More importantly, the systematic reforms implemented in response to Hope's case had created safeguards that made future abuse much more difficult to conceal. Marcus walked along the familiar shoreline where Hope's rescue had taken place, remembering every detail of that morning when a drowning bear cub had changed his life forever. The area had been designated as the Hope Wildlife Sanctuary, where no research was permitted except passive observation designed to support conservation efforts. Families of bears now used the location regularly, their cubs playing in the same waters where Hope had nearly drowned 3 years earlier. As he completed his memorial circuit, Marcus heard a sound that made his heart skip, the distinctive call of a young bear in distress. His training immediately kicked in as he located the source, a cub that appeared to be trapped on a small island about 30 yards from shore. The water was too deep for the young animal to swim safely, and its mother was nowhere to be seen. Marcus approached carefully, using the techniques that Hope's story had helped develop for ethical wildlife intervention. The new protocols emphasized minimal human contact while ensuring animal safety, balancing respect for natural processes with the responsibility to prevent unnecessary suffering. As he assessed the situation, he realized this rescue would be different from Hope's, informed by hard-won knowledge about the boundaries between help and interference. The cub was older and stronger than Hope had been, probably 8 months old and fully capable of swimming if not exhausted by panic. Rather than entering the water immediately, Marcus used vocal cues to calm the animal while positioning rescue equipment that would allow the cub to save itself. This approach honored both the animal's dignity and the lessons learned from Hope's tragic fate. Within 20 minutes, the cub had used a floating platform to reach shore safely, where it was reunited with its mother who had been searching frantically nearby. The reunion was joyful and natural, free from the human interference that had ultimately doomed Hope despite the best intentions. Marcus watched from a respectful distance as the bear family disappeared into the forest, their bond intact and their wildness preserved. The successful rescue felt like a gift from Hope herself, a demonstration that her death had meaning beyond the legal and policy changes it had inspired. Every animal saved using the ethical protocols developed in her memory was a living testament to the proposition that humans could help wildlife without dominating or exploiting it. Marcus returned to the ranger station to complete his daily reports, but his thoughts remained with Hope. The foundation bearing her name now employed over 200 people worldwide, from research monitors to educational specialists who taught children about respecting wildlife. Schools across America used Hope's story as a teaching tool about empathy, ethics, and the complex relationships between humans and nature. The documentary about Hope's life and death had reached over 50 million viewers, inspiring a generation of young conservationists who understood that individual animals mattered as much as species preservation. Social media campaigns sharing Hope's story had generated millions of dollars for wildlife protection organizations, proving that authentic emotional connections could motivate meaningful action better than abstract appeals to environmental responsibility. Marcus had received thousands of letters from people whose lives had been changed by Hope's story. Children wrote about choosing careers in wildlife protection. Adults described changing their voting patterns to support conservation candidates, and families shared stories of visiting national parks with new appreciation for the animals they encountered. Each letter reminded Marcus that Hope's influence extended far beyond the reforms her death had directly inspired. As evening approached, Marcus made one final visit to Hope's memorial. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lake, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. This was the time of day when Hope had been most active during her brief life, when her playful energy and curious intelligence had been most apparent to those who loved her. "I kept my promise, girl," Marcus whispered to the memorial stone. "No other animal will suffer like you did. Your trust in humans wasn't misplaced. It just took us too long to prove worthy of it." The sound of approaching footsteps drew Marcus's attention to a young park ranger who had hiked up from the visitor center. Jessica Martinez was one of the new generation of wildlife officers trained according to Hope Foundation protocols, and her dedication to ethical animal protection reminded Marcus daily that Hope's legacy would outlive everyone who had known her personally. "Sir, I wanted to update you on the quarterly monitoring reports," Jessica said, her voice carrying the respectful tone that all Hope Foundation staff used when discussing their namesake. "We've documented successful interventions in 43 cases this quarter, with 0 instances of inappropriate human contact or protocol violations." Marcus smiled, remembering his own early days as a ranger when such comprehensive ethical oversight had been unimaginable. "Hope would be proud," he replied, meaning every word. As they walked back toward the ranger station together, Marcus reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that terrible night when he had held a dying bear cub in his arms. Hope's death had been devastating, but her life had inspired changes that would protect countless other creatures for generations to come. Love had triumphed over cruelty, compassion had defeated exploitation, and one small bear's trust in humanity had ultimately redeemed an entire system of wildlife management. The stars were fully visible now, brilliant points of light scattered across the Montana sky. Marcus looked up at them and smiled, knowing that somewhere in that vastness, Hope's spirit lived on in every act of kindness shown to a wild creature, every ethical choice made by a researcher, and every child who learned that animals deserved respect rather than domination. Message for American seniors. Fellow Americans, at our age we've witnessed profound changes, but Hope's story reminds us that it's never too late to make a difference. This brave park ranger, like many of us in our generation, chose courage over comfort when it mattered most. Marcus Thompson could have followed protocols and walked away, but he listened to his heart and saved a drowning bear cub. Though Hope's life ended tragically, her legacy sparked nationwide reforms protecting countless animals. At 55 to 68, we possess the wisdom, experience, and moral authority to stand up for what's right. Whether it's speaking out against injustice, protecting the vulnerable, or simply showing kindness to those who can't defend themselves, we can still change the world. Hope's story proves that one person's compassion can inspire millions and transform systems that seemed unchangeable. What act of courage might you take today? Share in the comments. What injustice have you witnessed that needs a voice like Marcus's? Have you ever had a life-changing encounter with an animal that taught you about love and loyalty?